Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson. We're continuing our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. We're in chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 10 through 17 today. It's going to be a little light in the darkness, a little light. There'll be a little more light in verse 18, and then a whole lot of darkness again for quite a while. But as we mentioned, have been mentioning the last few days, we cannot forget that he has removed eternity from the equation, that we're talking about choosing life over death, not heaven over hell. And when you take away the punishment of hell and the reward of heaven and the notion of an eternal life, then this is the kind of world we're left with, and it's not the kind of world we want to live in. And so let's not forget that. We left yesterday talking about the way power corrupts and exponentially corrupts. The more levels of power that you add, the corruption increases exponentially, which is something he communicated in verse 8. But then he says in verse 9 that even in this world, if all we have is a world here, a wise king is committed to cultivated fields. In other words, into investing in the success of the kingdom as a whole, not in extracting from the kingdom the riches that he can take for himself. And he's going to continue in verse 10 by talking about the foolhardiness of this, because money will never satisfy. Let's read chapter 5, beginning with verse 10. We're going to read through verse 17. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is also vanity, nothingness. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Sweet is the sleep of a laborer when he eats, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. This is a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. The word grievous probably should be translated sickening, because that's what the word actually means. This is sickening. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil, that he may carry away in his hand. This is also a grievous, sickening evil. Just as he came, he shall go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness and in much vexation, sickness, and anger. That's why I think sickening should be there, because sickness is there in verse 17. Money will never satisfy. The goods, the more you have, the more pariahs there are to nibble up what you have, whether it be in government taxes or folks who are trying to take what it is you have. The Apostle Paul says the very same thing in 1 Timothy chapter 6, if you'd like to read that. Of course, Charles Wallace, Mr. Biggie Smalls, told us that back in the 90s, didn't he? He said it in 4 words: more money, more problems. And that's what Solomon is saying right here. And of course, we know the truth of this. We know the truth of this, that those who want to continue to increase their wealth will never be satisfied. And he calls it sickening. And what is even more sickening is that when someone wastes the gifts that they've been given so they can't pass them on to their children. He calls this sickening. In between those two laments, he gives us the little bit of light in verse 12. Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. That's true, because they didn't have any Rantadine or omeprazole, or they didn't have anything. If you overindulged, you had nothing to treat your overindulgence. But the person who puts in a good day's labor whether he has a good dinner or a meager one, will have a good night's sleep because of his labor. And that in itself is a gift that they can't tax away from you. And so there is a little bit of light in this passage. When he talks about the guy who wastes the gifts that he has been given so he can't pass them on, that when he dies as penniless as the day when he was born, and this being sickening to Solomon. We have to remember that this is a man who accomplished a great deal, and who accumulated a great deal, and who had it to pass on to his children. Now, what we know from history, from the biblical account, is that it didn't help. It didn't help. His son, who came after him, Rehoboam, was a terrible, evil king who almost immediately squandered everything his father had built, and divided his kingdom and lost 10 tribes and was left with only 2. So, yes, this is sickening, but handing your wealth over to your children doesn't mean that that's going to be positive for them. This eating in darkness and in much vexation and sickness and anger, that contrasts the sleeping in verse 12, because someone who eats in darkness is somebody who works from sun up to sundown. So if he gets a little bit in the morning, and then he gets a little bit in the evening, then that is the lot of a day laborer. Someone who would work 24/7, in this mode, in this routine, having the Sabbath off, or maybe not. Maybe it's 24/7, 365. But you're always eating in darkness because you're supposed to be in the field or on the job as soon as the sun was up, and you were not allowed to go home until the sun went down. So the only time you had for yourself was darkness, to eat your small meal and to get a little bit of sleep. Sometimes of the year, that darkness didn't last 8 hours. And so, the person who has squandered the gifts that God has given him doesn't even have the sweet sleep of verse 12. He just has vexation, sickness, and anger. And that anger ought to be directed at himself. Okay, we'll look at the end of chapter 5. We'll look at verses 18 and 19 and 20 tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.